Tell me something that you loved about your father.
Whenever I think of my father, it seems that it brings tears to my eyes. No words can explain how deeply my love is for my father. I can remember when the days when we lived in Pinedale in the Rock House, and my dad would have to go to Phoenix to work. And I remember how lonely I got, because he would be gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and then come home to see us. And I was so happy to see him. And so the bond between my father and I was tremendous. Some of the other things that he did was, well, he expected things from me, and I appreciate that, because he wanted me to grow to be a man who was reliable and carry out the responsibilities of being a father and on my own. But he was always a happy man. He always had, we no more than get home, and then the first thing that happens is we had to get a project. On one of the earlier projects I remember, he was needing to get some things to be able to build a little house across the way from the Rock House. And he brought home pieces of wood from where they've been constructing things, and bent nails and all kinds of things. And I can remember that we sat down on the hearth in the living room, right in front of the fireplace, and we each had a hammer. Bonnie and me and Dad and Mom, and we'd sit there on the concrete, and we would pound the nails straight. Didn't have any money to buy straight ones, so we would straighten them out. And he had a 5-gallon bucket, and it was completely full of bent nails. And we went through and straightened all those nails out so that he would have those. And we saved the lumber of things, and he could just go ahead and get everything. He didn't waste anything. And that's one of the things. And it was exciting to do some things like that. One of the things I remember very much, I think it was Christmas time, but I'm not sure, but we only had the only things we had for dishes was lots of times was tin cans and various other things. And when my dad came home from someplace, I don't know where he went to, but when he came home, he stayed up a little late that night, and when we got up in the morning, he had a complete set of dishes for Mother, and he had them on the dining room table, and it filled the entire table. We never saw so many dishes in our life, and they were kind of a light green. And my mother was in tears because some things that she did, and mixed.
Let it roll.
So my mother was very thrilled with the dishes, because to have a set of dishes was a wonderful thing, and so we were able to have that done. And I guess some of them are still in the family someplace, but that's wonderful.
Is it those light green kind of Melmac type dishes? I remember those.
And he had, and that set came complete, and every dish, I guess 10 or 12, I don't know what, and the ones that were large larger bowls, the whole set. I don't know how he got it there. But he surprised Mom, and it was very wonderful. Some of the other things that we had were, we had a dog, and I remember in the kitchen, our stove was a wood stove. I had to go out and chop wood, because Dad couldn't always be there. So go out and chop the wood with an axe and split it up, and then take it in my arms and pile it next to the stove, in a box, of course. And with the box, but right next to the box would be the dog underneath the stove. And the kitchen wasn't the kitchen without him laying in there. And
Was that in Pinedale when you had that dog?
right in the rock house. Mm-hmm. He was in the rock house there. And all of these things.
What was the name of the dog?
I don't remember. But it would be some simple name. And that was one of the things we do. But when Dad would come home, he'd say, "Come out. Can you come out and help me?" That was not a maybe if you want to. He went. He worked hard and strong and long, and I can remember he was planting. We were planting some. He was going to plant some corn, and he didn't. So we went out with a shovel, and he handed me a shovel, and he says, "Now, Joseph, what I want you to do is to dig a hole that's deep." And I said, "Oh, well, this is crazy. You can't put the seed clear down in the bottom of a deep hole, about at least 10 inches deep, or maybe 12 inches deep." And I said, "What are you doing like that?" He says, well, you just, we're going to put these in, and we dig it down, and then he says, then we'll put in the seeds, and then we'll put just a little bit of water in there, and pour the water on it, and add just a little bit of dirt. And I says, "Why do you do that, Dad?" And he says, well, the water, the earth below, down deeper in the earth, it stays wet. And when the sun shines and makes all the rest of the field dry, all you do is you go down the row, and you pour a little bit of water in each hole, so that the corn would start. And then he says, and then as the corn start, the corn stalks begin to grow tall. Then you come along and you push some dirt in, and then you water it some more. And so you would go down the field, and we planted corn down the field, and I was so excited that we done it, and I'd never heard of anybody doing that. But if you didn't own any machinery or special things to plant your garden, you can learn how to do things that will make it grow and take care of it. And also, the corn won't bend over when it comes up deep, and then all of a sudden you get the holes finally full. They would be able to be they wouldn't fall over, because there's like a stick that you've stuck in the ground, and the corn stalk won't fall over.
So it worked.
Oh, it worked, yes. And I later noticed that, anyway, Dad said that he had learned that from some of the farmers around. He used to tell a story about one of the farmers that he worked for when he was a boy in Pinedale. He went over to the man's house, and he had a whole bunch of beans, and his crop was completely growing and starting off. And he says, "Perry, I want you to cut these beans." And he says, "If we let all the beans grow, then they just crowd each other out, and you don't get a crop. What we need to do is get rid of some of them." And so he went over there, and he says, "I didn't want to cut some of those out, because it just seems like a waste." And so I'd chop with a hoe, and then I'd move over quite a ways, and the man that owned the farm came to him, and he says, "Perry, that won't work." He says, "You need to just practically to destroy the beans. You go through and cut and leave only a few in a spot, and then jump a little space about a foot or more away." And he says, so he says, "What you do is you chop and chop and chop and chop." And he says, "If you don't do like that, you'll never get through the whole field." And he says, "And if you don't chop it up," and he says, "I'll fire you," or something. And so but Dad would stand and laugh when he would talk about it. And he says, so I really went to town. He says, I practically did it. But he says, I chopped him up the way that he really wanted. And he was so proud of me but the farmers and people that were poor, and during the Depression times there, you had to know how to do your crop. You didn't have a machinery to go plant all of the thing or come along and cut away the ones, but it was fun. But Dad was always doing something like that. And one of the things that I remember about my father, he always was good to me. He showed great love to me, and I learned to love my father because I could feel that he loved me. But then the times come when you finally get to where you go through the teenage years, and when you get to be a teenager, you begin to think that you've got all of these things to do, and you don't have time to get that thing done or something else. Well, this story will be in Mesa. And I can remember that Dad had some. He was going off to work, and as he left the house, he said, "Joseph, I want you to mow the lawn because I'm going to have some men come over here." And he says, "I want the front yard to look right." And he says, "Would you be sure and mow the lawn?" And I says, "Yeah, Dad, I'll get it done." And so I got busy doing some of the things I was doing, and I worked around got some other things done, and then I stopped and then did some playing, and all of a sudden my dad showed up. I didn't expect him to be that soon. And he said, and he spoke cross to me and said, he says, I only asked you to mow the lawn, and I says, you should have been able to do that right away. Anyway, I was ashamed that I didn't get the timing right, and so I felt badly and thought that he was and so anyway, I went in the house and I was crying, and I tried to tell him that I didn't catch the thing, but he wanted me to have mowed the lawn first, which I didn't do, and if I'd have done it the other way, it'd all been come out. And I was trying to do it, but Dad felt badly about it, and so my mother was standing there, and I was trying to explain it to my dad, and he didn't seem to want to understand it. And finally, I don't know if what had hit me, but all of a sudden I felt that he really didn't appreciate me and love me, because he was speaking harsh to me. And so I spoke out loudly to him, which I never ever did to me. And I says, I don't know why you're so hard to me. And I says, sometimes I guess I don't even know whether you love or not. Do you love me? And I yelled that out, which I'd never done any other time in my life. I was about 17, and I ran back out down the hallway, out through the door, and out to my bedroom, which was plywood boards next to the stairs on the east side of the house. And I walked in there, and I fell down on the bed, and there was just room enough for the clothes to hang over the steps on the one side, and I just fell down on the bed and was crying because I felt so ashamed that I had spoke back to him. And I'd only been there about 5 minutes, and the door came open. Dad opened the door, and I jumped out of bed, down to the bed, and ran to him, and I says, Daddy, I love you. And as I reached out to hug him, his tears were running down his cheeks. And I said, Daddy, I love you. I'm sorry that I said all the things. And we held each other for at least 20 minutes without even moving. But by the time that we had a hug there, I was prompted by the Spirit that my Father loved me more than anything else. With all of his might, mind, and strength. And I was his only son, and he loved me. And you know, my dad, and from that point on, there's nothing that my dad ever did. There was no way that I would ever believe that he didn't love me again. And I could see that I didn't really understand him well. And my whole attitude in my teenage years changed. And that day, and never changed the rest of his life. He could say anything in the world. He could have shouted at me, not speak kindly. It wouldn't matter, because I knew that I was loved. I always knew my Father loved me. But my father was a different man than I was. I was a joyful boy, and my dad was very determined, and he was always working, always doing something and everything. And it seemed that at times I was almost ashamed. My dad never met a man that he didn't like. He he would go walk up to a stranger when we'd park the car and go to Phoenix for business or something, and Mom and him and me and Bonnie would go, and he would go out, and when he got out of the car, he'd walk over to a guy sitting on the bench on the sidewalk, and he'd start talking to him, and he'd tell him his whole life story. And it was embarrassing. Bonnie she had a terrible time with it too. And he was long, and then he'd go in there, and it seemed like forever to get all the business stuff done, and he would and then he had the same thing I'm doing. He would start to say something, and then he would say it different, and he had a different way in putting his sentences together, and it bothered me, and so I'd see other people, and I wonder why my dad can't be like that. Well, the reason he couldn't is because he is who he is. But at times I actually was ashamed of some of the funny things that he did. And in doing that, but after the incident that I told you, when he came, the fact that he loved me more than anything else came to me by the Spirit. And it never happened again. My dad could go out and say things and say the extra things that he said in his sentences and all kinds of things. It absolutely never bothered me. Didn't matter and didn't care. And if he'd said it backwards, or if he got it backwards or something, I knew that I was loved, and the rest of my life I was dead. And so that was the.
Well, let me ask you, tell me about your mother. What were your feelings about your mother?
Well, let me finish my dad.
Okay.
When I was growing up in...
Start that sentence over, okay?
Okay.
When I was growing up in Pinedale, or maybe?
No, when I got to be about 14 or 15, I'd say, Dad, I says, can I go out and work with you? And he says, no. He said, no. He says, well, you're not going to be able to work for a while. And so I was anxious, and I said, so when I got to be about 16, I'm about 15, I said, Dad, I want to go on the job with you. I can just do something. Can't I work with you? Because I really wanted to work with you. And he says, no, Joseph, you can't go to work. I says, but Dad, look at me. And I pulled my arm up and showed my muscle and said, see, I got good muscles and I'm strong and I can lift things. And he says, Joseph, you will not be going on the job until you're 16. I says, Dad, why do I have to wait until I'm 16? I'm strong enough to do it now. He says, forget it. You're not going on the job until you're 16. So I waited through the times, waiting for 16 to come, and eventually 16 came. It seemed like it was 7 years later because I was anxious. And so my dad went down to the Union Hall and got my papers put up, and I was started an apprenticeship in plastering. I still remember we got on the job, and he says, "Now everything's going to be fine." He says, "I'll be able to be right here with you, and I'm going to show you how to do it." And of course, all the big men there that would think, and then of course they would be kind of people that start to tease you and stuff. And I walked over to the edge of the scaffold and tried to take the mud off my hawk. That hawk is what you put the mud on, and then you try to put it onto the trowel so you can put it on the wall. And every time I tried to take it off, it fell on me, it slipped down my front and landed on the top of my shoes. And my dad, he says, "Well, Joseph, I've got to go someplace." And of course I knew, I figured that he would not give it back because he'd get off someplace and he had so many things to do. And so he got off, and I was left alone. And the mud came down, and I'd push it up, and finally I figured up, and I put the mud on the hawk, put the hawk up against the wall, pushed the mud off the hawk against the wall, and got away with it that way. And of course the big men around there just laughed at me. and right there I says, "You know, I will be a journeyman plaster come what may, and to find out what it was doing." And after a few days of plastering and trying to get to work, and then these men that were there around, I had another thing came to me. I knew that my father was always right when he said, "You will never be able to come on the job until you're 16 years old." And it wasn't because I wasn't strong enough, but the attitude of many of the plasters, they had a mouth that would, every word that came out of their mouth was a swear word. And they conversate. You just have to get rid of this part. Right. So as I was plastering around there, and they would go on working their part, you'd follow, you just...
Just start that over and say, "As I was plastering," just start over on that.
I'll have to do that.
A little drink. We'll stop it for a minute.
So by the time I'd been working with on the job there about for three days, as I was working at it, it came to my mind as vividly as I live that my dad knew what he was doing, and when he told me that I could not go on the job until I was 16 because of and I found out it was not my strength or I couldn't learn. At 15, I was put into the den of lions. Those people, plasters, they told all kinds of crazy jokes, dirty, filthy things, and swore and all kinds of things, and it was just almost more than you can bear. And then so I once again found that my father was wiser than myself.
Very good. Okay, now tell me about your mother. How did you feel about your mother?
My mother was an angel. She was a precious woman, and I knew that my mother was always loved her children. And it was so wonderful thing. When I was first very young, I can remember that we lived in a log cabin over by the wash. The homestead cabin was across the wash and further down the canyon, but it long since decayed and broke down, and so we were living in the smaller log cabin
in Pinedale.
In Pinedale, yeah, and so that was the place that we lived, and I can remember.
Was it small?
It was extremely small, and my dad had extended the kitchen so that we had room enough to take care of the family there. And of course, one of the things, my grandmother lived with us, Grandma Hancock, and she was real nice to me. She kind of took a shine to me. But I was just a boy, and I loved to do everything, and Mom, just sort of let me run around, go over and go into the ditch there, and we had a well that was dried, it had fallen in from the walls, and they had salamanders down in there, and I played with salamanders, but they weren't they were gooey. But I was just a young boy. I was 3 years old, and at the times I remember these things, and my mother was teaching school in Pinedale. She had graduated from Tempe University in the Valley.
It was called Tempe Normal School.
Tempe Normal School. Yeah, that was the name. And when after she graduated from there, she taught school, and she got the job to teach in Pinedale. And we lived in the log cabin, and Mother would take me with her when she'd go to school, and we'd go over to the fence, and you didn't want to go all the way around the fences. You're too long to get there, so they built a stile, and you'd walk up the stile, and it has a flat board on the top, and then you have stairs going down the side, and so you can just walk over the steps, and then you go right over and go to the church. The school that she taught in was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The church gave permission for the school to be there because there was no school in Pinedale, and my mother was teaching the first, second, third, and fourth grades, all in the same room. She was a whiz. And then there was no such thing as kindergarten in that day, so I always say that I was there and being in kindergarten. She'd put me over in the corner, give me a box of crayons and paper and stuff and things to do, and then it'd be fun for a while, and then I'd get a little bit bored, and anyway, I just sort of had to run, and I could walk around a bit. We couldn't interfere with what the kids were doing, and so that was it. And so I got an early start in school. And one of the days came by, we walked out the door, and Dad was, at this time of life, we were in the Depression. The reason we were in Pinedale was because there was no work. And Dad would go around and work with the farmers and stuff, and he would be paid in potatoes or beans or other things, but never with money, because nobody had any money. The Depression was there. And so Dad was working on his Model T Ford, and we came out one morning, and as we walked out that morning, I was all set to go, and we looked, and as we passed Dad, I saw him working there, and so I let go of my mother's hand, and I turned, ran over, and stood up on the front bumper of the Ford, and looked down. And Dad was putting he was working on that, and so Mom says, "Come on, Joseph, we need to go." And I says, "But Mom, I want to stay with Daddy." And she says, "Well, Perry, are you going to be busy? Can you?" Always says, "I don't have anything lined up." He said, "Just leave them with me today." And I said, "Okay." He said, "Oh," I was so thrilled I didn't know what to do. And so I was standing there on the bumper and looking at it, and Dad reached over into his pocket on this side and says, he didn't say anything, he just pulled that out, and he pulled out a sack. And I knew what that sack was. I'm only 3 years old. I know what that sack was. It was tobacco. And I broke into tears. I says, "Daddy, what is that?" Oh, I didn't say, "What is it?" I said, "Daddy, what are you going to do with that?" And he says, he says, "Don't worry." He says, "I'm going to put this in the radiator of the car to plug the holes so it won't lose all the water." And I was so relieved. And it is all, I've always remembered that I knew the principles of the gospel. You're not supposed to smoke at 3 years old. And knew that my father didn't do that. And I was scared to death he was. So that was it. And so he poured it down in there and threw the bag away, and everything was fine. When my bedroom in the log cabin in Pinedale was, if you're in the kitchen, then you go towards the back of the house and you open the door and go in there, and that's where I slept. And Mom came in that night to put me to bed, and she knelt down that night. I don't know why this particular thing was, but I remember she said, "Well, Joseph, you want to have prayers with me?" And I says, "Yeah." And so my mother started praying. And as she prayed, the strangest thing happened. It seemed like there was someone in the room. And I felt so strong that I actually did what I didn't dare do. I opened my eyes and I looked around in the room and tried to see where he was. And I didn't see him, but I knew that there was somebody there. And I was grateful for that because it helped me know that there are people that are come and are watching around and watching over us. And it was, and I was a young boy and felt that way. My mother was always so sweet and so loving. She never got cross or anything like that. She would just talk to you about something, and as you sat there and talked to her, and then she was explained what she has in mind, and you just felt like you're supposed to go do it. There was it was really wonderful to have her as a mother. My grandmother was in Pinedale also, and she lived with us. And
which grandmother?
This is Grandmother Hancock.
Okay, repeat that again. My grandmother Hancock. Okay, just say that again.
Yeah. My grandmother, Grandma Hancock, she lived with us in Pinedale. And for some reason or other, she kind of took a shine to me. I don't know what it was. I guess, well, she had 9 boys. So I guess she was sort of used to having boys around. And besides, I thought most everybody loved each other, so one day I was doing something or other, and she didn't want me to do it. And she says, "Joy." They called me Joy, and I didn't like the name. My name is Joseph Perry Hancock, and I wanted people to call me Joseph, but everybody decided somewhere along the line to call me Joy. It took me more than 20 years to get rid of that Joy, and I'd be able to be called by my rightful name, Joseph. And every time we'd have family reunions and stuff, I says, "I'm Joseph." Finally get that. But anyway, she had decided that I'm going to do something, and I probably told her that I didn't think I wanted to do that. And she says, "Joy, you go down over there to the willows." And the willows grew just over into the ditch there. And she says, "You take your pocket knife and you go down there and cut off a willow and bring it up to me, and I'm going to give you a swat so that you know that I'm the boss." And so I smiled and I said, "Okay." So I went down there and I got the regular size one, and I picked it up, cut it off, went up there, and she took the stick and she whacked me across the back. And so I laughed. And then that make her mad, and then she whipped me again. So she hit me about 3 times, you know, and I'd laugh. And then it was all over, and I said, okay. Then I'd go play with the stick and everything else, and then I'd go on and do it with the lie. Well, it wasn't many times, and this went on, and she did that, and it didn't hurt anything, you know. And so what? And she had now made sure that I knew that she was the boss. So that was the way it was. I mean, my grandmother, Hancock.
Start that one again, my grandmother Hancock.
My grandmother Hancock would always be tough.
Just start over.
Let me start in the middle of a sentence here, and it'll be all right. Later on, my grandmother had an occasion to think that I didn't do what she wanted me to do, so she asked. She did this all the time, and it didn't bother me at all. So this time she told me, go down to the willow and get me a willow and come up, and I'm gonna give you a saw. I said, okay, Grandma. So I'd go down. Of course, I like to cut the willows anyway. And this time I says, you know, I know what I'm gonna do. I'll just get a small one. And that small willow won't hurt as much as it does. I'm really gonna be smart, and I'm gonna trick her. And so I went down there and I got one that was just about as about a 16th of an inch. And I brought it to her and handed it to her, and she says, all right, now then, here this, and she's hit me, and that tiny little thing stung like a bee. I said, oh, wow, wow. And then out of the eye says, how come that's way? I thought that would be different. And boy, I never brought her a thin whip before. I learned the laws of physics that day. So it was fun. But that was, she would, she just loved to sit and talk. So I'd go in and the house, and she'd corner you, and then she'd start telling you Indian stories. And they were long, tremendous Indian stories that we got. She told of when they first came to Pinedale, they got their property. The government would give you I can't remember this, but it was a homestead. You get a homestead, and you, if you work on the property for 3 years, then you get it for free. And so, so they lived there, and they were Indians there, and they were down the street, and they lived there, and there are many stories about that she would tell us, and one one of the ones she talked about would be when they first came and they brought their wagon. And they stopped and they parked and they just didn't undo the stuff that was in the wagon. And they had all the things that they owned, their stove and their things. And when they woke up the next morning, they found Grandpa Hancock. Of course, I wasn't alive at this time, but this is the story that she tells back when she was there. And Grandpa Hancock went out to milk the cow that they brought with him. And the cow had wandered off. Cows do that. I found that one of the things you get to do. Go find the cow. So he went up the canyon, and he couldn't see it, so he came back and saddled a horse. And then he went on up to the canyon and looked further up. He went about 4 miles. And when you get about 4 miles up the canyon, the little mound rises, and it's a rolling hill, and it kind of has a saddle on it. The hill's a little higher here and a little higher over there, and you go up the hill and then go through the lowest part so you don't have to climb so high. And so he was going up to that, and as Grandpa was walking along, he heard a voice, and the voice said, "Go north." And he turned around and looked to see where he was going. He didn't see anybody. And so the next place, he just kept right on going. And then the voice said, "Go north." And he looked around, and then he began to understand what it might be, because his father had experiences like that and told stories to him. And so then he kept on going, and then the voice came a third time and says, "Go north." And he says, "Well, I'm going north," because they knew that he was being prompted by the Spirit. And so he turned and went up the saddle. And as his horse went up the saddle, finally got high enough so that he could see over the saddle. And there was a band of Indians coming to the saddle and would come down, and they would come down and pass where they had parked on their homestead. So he turned around and went back on to Pinedale, and there where he was, and warned all of the people that were there, and they went into a major building. And when the Indians came by his wagon, they tore off the top of the thing, took their books, they burned them, killed their chickens by taking hold of the head and wringing the chickens' necks. They killed their pig, and everything else, and scattered everything all over the place, made a mess of the whole thing. And my grandmother's stove, the only thing you can have to be able to cook your food, and they broke it up, broke the plates on it and stuff. And when they came back, they sat there and sobbed. Grandma was so. And then she said, as we went over to the place where they burned a lot of stuff, they said that every book that we had, it was burned. And they looked down there, and they saw a book, and they reached down and picked it up, and the book that they picked up that was not burned was the Book of Mormon. And stories like that, where she had dozens of them, of things that they did, and it was a wonderful thing. But it was one of my enjoyments, is to hear her tell the stories. My mother I loved with all my heart, and I knew that she loved me. And she so always just loved to sit in the living room, and when we were there, and we would talk, and she loved to talk about the church and things, and doing the things that we ought to be doing. She was kind and loving, and loved her children, everyone. She was so very wonderful. She never, ever punished me with any spankings or something like that. And she was always, since you knew that everything, when you get a job asked to be doing something, we do it. And so that was my mother, an angel from heaven.